Good morning, HFC kids. We're back on a Sunday morning. We are relaxed, we are focused, and we are learning about the good, wise King Solomon, who we learned before chose God's way, not man's way. However, this week, he did not choose God's way. He does not choose God's way all the time. As we are aware, no one can choose God's way all the time. So, what happens when you're the wisest man ever? Ladies and gentlemen, the results are humiliating. This is a lesson where people fail. Because men fail sometimes. People are not always going to follow God. When they first said they wanted a king, God reminded them, no matter how good the king is, he's not going to be perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect person, unless you're talking about Jesus. And Solomon is not Jesus. So it was bound to happen. There was going to be something he did that would show his weakness, that would show that he was not good enough to be God. He was not good enough to be the best king ever. His son, or his father, David, was amazing, but he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. And actually, one of his biggest mistakes had to do with a woman named Bathsheba. That was one of David's biggest mistakes. He followed God with everything he had, but he made a mistake with this woman named Bathsheba, and it ruined everything. And like father, like son, Solomon doesn't do so hot with women either. But before we get into the scripture reading for today, before we start looking at what the passage has to say about Solomon's downfall, I wanted to do a little bit of a review of our books of the Bible that we have been talking about so far. We started in the book of Genesis back in March, April, May. I want to say it was April that we started to hardcore start studying the book of Genesis. And then we eventually made it all the way to the book of 1 Kings, where we are now. So since we've made it so far, since we've been through all these books in the past few months, I wanted to take a second to review these because the story, understanding where the Israelites have come from and what God has taught them in the past, knowing this history is part of something really important for this week's lesson. Remembering the story, if he would have actually remembered it, it probably would have helped Solomon a little bit. But he chose to either forget it or ignore it. So we're going to go over it so that we don't make bad mistakes, crazy mistakes, like Solomon did that eventually led to the fall of the kingdom. We started in the book of Genesis. Genesis talks about creation. We didn't really go over a lot of creation. We did that last year in Kids Church. So we didn't talk about a lot of creation, but we talked about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and how those people were huge fathers of the Israelite people. They were promises that God had made to Abraham. Abraham didn't have kids, but God promised him that because of his faithfulness, because of how much Abraham followed God, Abraham would have many descendants called the Israelites. And then later you meet his son, Isaac, and then his son, Jacob, and then his son, Joseph, that eventually lead us to Egypt. But when they got to Egypt, during the famine, we learned that the Israelites had become slaves to the Pharaoh. So a man named Moses, who you see here, had to take the people out of Egypt. And this was called the Exodus. Exodus is a word meaning leaving. So if all of us left church at the same time, that would be considered the Exodus. If we all were in kids' church and we all just got up and left, that would be the Exodus. The book of Exodus in the Bible is when the Israelites got up and left Egypt, but only because they had God's power on their side, only because Moses listened to God and followed God, and that led them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and toward their promised land. In the book of Leviticus, this is where God gave rules. They came in the book of Exodus too. You had the 10 Commandments. Those were a really big deal. We learned about them. We learned about there should be no other gods except our God. There should be no men marrying women who aren't supposed to be their wives. You're supposed to stay loyal to the person that you have committed to marry. One man, one woman forever. And there's also rules about murdering. You're not supposed to murder people. In Leviticus, it talks about what sacrifices look like, as you see here. When you do mess up, what do you do to help yourself become right with God? And we learned about how Jesus later, hundreds of years later, showed us that he was a sacrifice that made us all right with God. And Leviticus also talked about the medical laws and the martial laws and the different types of, we had the 5 M's, we went over those, and one of those was the law of mixing, and that you weren't supposed to mix with other groups of people because they didn't follow God, and they didn't follow God's rules. So God said, we're not mixing with them right now because they're going to be a bad influence. That's in the book of Leviticus. The book of Numbers, they're counting all the Israelites before they go into the promised land. They're making sure they know who all's there, who all's coming, who all's part of God's people. In the book of Deuteronomy is one last reminder before they go into the promised land. They were not always listening to God. They weren't perfect, but God was telling them that they were supposed to love him with all their heart, with all their soul, with all their mind, and with all their strength. And that is how the people would best succeed, if they were following God with everything they could. And then we get to the book of Joshua. Joshua is the next leader who comes in and actually takes the people into Israel. He's the one that after they've left Egypt and wandered around in the wilderness, now that they know the new laws, now that they have all the new people, it's time for them to go into the promised land. And they conquer different towns and different villages and different people groups so that they can live where they're supposed to be because of God's power. Then we get to the book of Judges, where the Israelites are not following the rules. They're doing things that are right in their own eyes instead of in God's eyes. They're not following God, they're following themselves. And this is not good. This eventually leads for different enemies to come in and conquer. And the judges were in charge of coming in and saying, if you followed God, it wouldn't be so bad for you right now. You need to listen and you need to follow God, and you need to remember the laws that we talked about back with Moses. If you follow God and worship him, then these bad things aren't going to happen to you anymore. And that's what the judges' jobs were. Then we have the book of Ruth. We didn't really talk about the book of Ruth, but Ruth was a woman who lived during the time of Israel, and her husband died during a plague or during a famine, and it wasn't very good. So because her husband died, only because her husband died, she was able to get married again. And that's reminded us one of those rules about it's supposed to be one man and one woman forever. But since the man died, she was able to get married again. And then her new son was able to be the grandfather of David, who we learn about in 1 Samuel. David was a fantastic king who followed God, who listened to God, who followed the rules, who wanted to serve him, who used God's power to defeat giants, to defeat armies, to lead the kingdom of Israel. He was the second king of Israel and the best king of Israel. And even though David wasn't perfect, he still got to be king for a very long time and have a very successful kingdom. So 1 and 2 Samuel follow the story of Samuel, the prophet, the last judge, as well as David and his rule. And then David had a son named Solomon. And Solomon and David and the different kings in Israel are discussed in 1 and 2 Kings. So today our passage is in 1 Kings, where Solomon didn't remember what happened during all of this. If he would have thought about it, if he would have remembered and thought about God's way over his way, then it would have probably gone a lot better for him. So we're going to learn a little bit about the fall of Israel and the fall of Solomon. Solomon chose to follow God, and he was a great king. He led the people very well. But God warned him. In 1 Kings chapter 9, he reminded him of the different rules that were given to Moses, the different things that were taught, that if you're really going to follow God, there are certain things that you have to follow. And for the most part, Solomon did a pretty good job, but he had a couple weaknesses. God came and reminded him, you need to follow the rules or bad things are going to happen. In chapter 9, verse 6, it says, God is talking to Solomon, and he says, if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and statutes that I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. Which means, if you're not following the rules, destruction is going to come. I've given you instructions. Your job is to follow them. And if you don't, you're going to be famous for failure. And it says, the people will say in verse 9, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold onto other gods, and worshipped them, and served them, the Lord has brought all of this disaster on them. So that's Solomon's warning. Solomon was super wise and super rich, and he could get whatever he wanted. And he used it to build a fantastic temple for God, a fantastic place for people to go and worship and give sacrifices. And it even says that Solomon was really good about making sacrifices to God. But even if you're following God in most of your life, there are still times that other parts of your life are not following God. And God sees your whole life. Even if you're doing well for the most part, he can still see that you're not doing the right thing sometimes. And he was not following the rule that's supposed to be one man and one woman forever. And he was not following that you should have no other gods before God. And he wasn't following the rule of mixing, that when you're mixing with other people, they're going to lead you to worship God, or to worship other gods, or worship other things instead of the true God, or make you break rules aside, because they're not from followers of God. If you're mixing with those people, they're going to lead you into ways that don't glorify God. And so even though he had his money, he used it sometimes on pretty girls to help them be happy worshiping their gods. He had 700 wives. 700, not one man, one woman forever. Look at the screen. This is 700 dots. Imagine them being 700 people. That's how many wives he had. And a lot of them were from countries that weren't Israel. And a lot of them followed gods that weren't our God. They worshiped false idols. And Solomon was used to getting whatever he wanted. And he was used to spending money on whatever he wanted. So all of these 700 women could get what they want. And if they wanted to follow another god, he gave them money to follow another god. Which meant the money that God had blessed him with was being used for other gods. In chapter 11, it caught up with him, and it says, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him and warned him twice. He had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord commanded. So, we said God promised that destruction and ruin would come. And we're going to talk a little bit about that next week, about what happens when the king has failed, when the king had 700 wives and wasn't following the rules, who wasn't following God's commands, who had too many women than he knew what to do with. He was using God's money that he had been blessed with for things that weren't good. And it's not fun to deal with. It's not, as we keep looking in the book of 1 Kings, it's not good for the kingdom of Israel because they trusted in a man who failed rather than trusting in God. I also want you to turn in next week, because next week, if you watch, we're going to talk a little bit more about even when you make mistakes, even if destruction and punishment comes, God still loves you and God still wants to help you. Yes, he's frustrated. Yes, he's disappointed. Yes, he wants to teach you a lesson, but there's more to it than that. And we're going to talk about that next week. So come back next Sunday to learn a little bit more about God's redemption, about God's healing that comes when you disobey him. And that's it for this week. I hope to see you next week for that. Also, I hope to see you on November 6th for Glow Night. If you've missed those announcements, there's a registration link in the description below. So you should click down there or fill out a Connect card and figure out how you can get involved with Glow Night November 6th at 6 p.m. We're going to have fun with pizza and games and trunk or treat, and it's going to be amazing. So I'll see you guys there. Bye.